Well, welcome again. And my throat is getting better as far as my voice. Hope I'm not too terribly offensive this morning. I think it's kind of a sexy voice. So I hope you do okay with this. My friends came last week and helped me out, and I was really thankful for that. I heard that those that were here, you really enjoyed it with Don and Drew from Hayden Lake. I was really glad they could help me, but they didn't begin with something humorous. So I knew you were anxious, and I brought something for you today. A story about a husband that was driving home from work, and he got pulled over and got a ticket for not wearing a seatbelt. So a couple of days later, would you believe it? He's driving the same, I think it's a true story. He's driving down the same street. He gets pulled over for not wearing a seatbelt, gets a ticket again from the exact same police officer. And the officer says, "So do you think you've learned your lesson this time?" And the man says, "Well, yes, I have. I'm going to have to start taking a different way home from work." All right. So I was 17 years old, a senior in high school, when I met a pretty girl. And we started working together at a hamburger joint down on Northwest Boulevard. And, she had long, curly auburn hair, beautiful eyes. She had these cute little freckles on her cheeks. And I started thinking, I'd like to get to know this lady better. And so we were having fun at work and getting to know each other. We're talking. We're kind of, learning little ways to make each other smile or giggle or whatever. And then, as we got to know each other more, I started thinking, to myself, I think I'd like to get even closer to this lady. And so I finally got up the nerve to ask her out on a date. We went to Denny's for pie and a movie. And we were both young and nervous and didn't know what to say. And we looked at each other. We didn't say a word over our pie. So good thing we were going to a movie next, so we didn't have to try to talk to each other. We're just so nervous, so we're sitting there. And everything was going really nicely, though. We really enjoyed being out with Sandy on this date. And I was thinking, I'd like to get even closer to this lady. Now, at this point, she decided to help me out a little bit because she was hoping that maybe I would hold her hand. And so she took her hand and she put it up on the little armrest in between the seats, and she just laid it out there for me, hoping that I would finally grab a hold. And so I'm not watching the movie any longer, right? I'm watching this hand and thinking I'd like to touch that hand, and I'm looking at the movie and then back down and looking back, and finally I got the nerve to do it, but it took so much energy from within me. My hand just leaped into the air and goes over and comes clamping down on her hand, and I just grabbed it, But we just enjoyed being together. We kept working together, and I just kept thinking, I would like to get even closer to this lady. And so eventually, we started dating, hanging out together, spending more and more time together. There was that first hug, that first kiss, that first time my fingers touched her hair, and then now we've been married for 30 plus years. And together we've shared all kinds of joys. We've shared pain. We've shared struggles and challenges. And we've celebrated many wonderful things together as well. And we've made it through. I share that with you, not to tell our story, but to share that romancing nature of drawing closer and closer and closer is the gospel story and the nativity story of God. But God longs to be reunited with his creation, his children. And though we were once separated from him by sin, every move of God has been under the purpose of drawing closer and closer and closer back into the presence of his children, to be restored, and reunited. Let's walk quickly through kind of this romance that God had with us. You see, when God created us, and you may have heard the story of the Garden of Eden, God could walk amongst his creation, he walked with them. He talked with them. They could share conversation and maybe even an embrace. God was right there in their presence, and they saw him, and there's no separation. There was no division. There was no wrong. There was no sin that caused him to pull away. But he could walk. The Bible talks with him walking in the garden with his children. That was his desire, his purpose. He wanted to love them. He wanted to be with them. He wanted to enjoy them. And he wanted us to enjoy him. That was the purpose and the plan from the beginning. But as we know, sin separated us from God. And ever since that separation happened, God has been working in history, trying to move us back towards that experience when we can know him and walk with him and talk with him again. Ultimately, we'll have that reward in heaven, to be with God, to walk through the gates of heaven and see Jesus face to face. It's the goal, it's the dream, the hope, the desire of every Christ follower to finally come into that place and see Jesus face to face. But since the garden until that point, God has been at work. Consider this, and I have some simple little illustrations. But you remember at that separation, God was not satisfied with that. God was not, that was not his plan. That's not what he wanted. And so he began to call to a people, the Israelites. He began to call to them and set them up as people and bring his presence down upon them. They had been, for hundreds of years, they had been slaves in Egypt. And God says, I'm going to set you free. I'm going to call you out. And we're going to begin this relationship. We're going to begin this process. And so God rescues them from Egypt. And his presence comes down around them in the form of a cloud. And this cloud hovered above them and guided them and showed them the way to go. In Exodus 13:21 it says, "And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night a pillar of fire to give them light, and that they might travel by day and by night." Isn't that such a glorious time when you know you are being led by the Lord? You know he's with you. His presence is there and he's guiding you. But God was not satisfied with this cloud that was up in the atmosphere. He says, I want to get closer to my creation. And next we see that heaven and earth touch for the first time since the Garden of Eden when they get to Mount Sinai. They've been walking through the desert, and God calls Moses to come up upon the mountain, and he, in the cloud, descended upon the mountain. And they met together, and there he gave him his instructions, the Ten Commandments, and he gave him a lot of instructions on how to lead the people and what to do. And God looked upon that and thought, but I want to get even closer. And so on the mountain, God gave Moses instructions to build what we call the tent of meetings or the tabernacle. It was a tent that it was made of curtains and rods, and he had all the people donate their jewels and their gold and their fabrics so they could build this beautiful tent-like structure that could be carried with them wherever they traveled as they went through the wilderness. And they would set it up whenever they stopped and God wanted to meet with the people, they would set it all up, and then the cloud would come down upon the tent, symbolizing that his presence was with them. Exodus 25 is where we find these instructions. God instructed Moses, let them make me a sanctuary. Why? He says, that I may dwell with my people. God wants so desperately to be with his children again. And so they set up this tabernacle where his presence could come down upon it, and he could be in the presence of his children. He could dwell among them. But God says, but I want to be even closer. I want to get even closer to them than that. He still wasn't satisfied. Later on, after they are taken to the promised land, and they begin taking domination over that area, David wants to build a temple before the Lord, but it's actually his son Solomon that completes the project of building the temple in Jerusalem. He prays after the completion of it. He prays this beautiful prayer of dedication. And then in 2 Chronicles chapter 7, it tells how fire came down from heaven. It consumes the sacrifices and the offerings that the people had brought. And it said that the glory of God filled the Lord's house. This became the house of the Lord where his presence would always be. He wouldn't come down and go away. His presence would be there. And they could come and worship. They could come and pray. They could come and make sacrifice. They could make pilgrimage to this place and worship their God in a place that was established for that purpose. But God wanted to get even closer. That still wasn't enough. There was still too much separation. There's too much still keeping him apart from his people. And so just 6 miles away from that temple that was built so long ago, in a little nowhere town, in a little nowhere barn, God entered our history. God was born in a manger. He wanted more than just to look upon us or to hover above us or to have his glory descend upon his house. God, from the beginning of this journey, had been romancing his way back into the lives of those who would seek him and those who would love him and those who would worship him so that he could dwell amongst us. You know the verses very well in Matthew 1:23. The Virgin Mary will be with child and will give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. God came to be with us and walk our sod, walk amongst us, to live as we live, and to take away every excuse, every separation, and then ultimately to take away every sin so that we could be completely restored with him. This takes us to our reading today in Luke chapter 2. We've been reading through the story there. As we look at it, we'll just be mindful of what caused the separation in the beginning. It was our rebellion. It was our sin. It was our wandering heart. Sin separated us from the beginning, and so God began to relentlessly pursue us throughout the ages and is pursuing you to this day because his desire is to be fully reconciled with you and take away all sin and take away all your pain and to give you a renewed heart and relationship with him. Look in chapter 2 of Luke in verse 21. It says that at the end of 8 days, now we've been reading, I said through this chapter, Jesus has been born now, so it's 8 days later after his birth. When he was circumcised, he was called Jesus, the name given him by the angel before he was conceived in the womb. And when the time came for their purification, according to the law of Moses, they brought him up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. As it is written in the law of the Lord, every male who first opens the womb shall be called holy to the Lord. And to offer a sacrifice according to what is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves and 2 young pigeons. So just a couple of thoughts on what's going on here. Joseph and Mary, they were very devout Jews. They were following all the decrees and all the laws of God. They wanted to honor God as his children and with this gift of his son that they had been given. And so they as was their custom, and they had Jesus circumcised at the 8th day. which is exactly as it was supposed to be. And it's very interesting. It had to happen on the 8th day. This is about the only law that was allowed to be exercised if it fell on a Sabbath. So the Sabbath was, it's a holy day, and they had all kinds of restrictions, rules, and things. This was about the only thing that they were allowed to do if it fell on a Sabbath. And so they had, not that this necessarily was, but it was the 8th day. They had Jesus circumcised, and then it says it came time for their purification. Well, that's a separate event. It's about 30 days later, a little over 30 days later, when Mary is healing from the birth, the delivery, and she can now go back into the temple and make worship before the Lord and make offering before the Lord. And so she comes and she presents Jesus before God, and then later on they come in, and it's interesting. There's an interesting detail, I thought, in verse 22. It says it was time for their purification. Some of the older transcriptions or translations rather say her purification, but your more modern translations are pretty convinced that this is a plural. This is more than one person. That this is more than just referencing Mary. And what's interesting is it can really make no reference to Joseph, because Joseph, he was not the natural father of the child, and he had no ritual or rites to go through of purification. So this purification was symbolic upon Mary and Jesus. Luke makes it apply to both of them, to Mary and to the Christ, as Calvin points out, that when you speak of the purification, Luke makes it apply both to Mary and to Christ, for the pronoun of them can have no reference whatsoever to Joseph. Why that's important is it seems as though from his very birth, Jesus begins the process of taking the weight of the sins of the world upon him. The very first thing to happen to him was to show his humanity, to show that he left his divine throne to become a male and to be circumcised, and needed to start following the rites and rituals of purification, because the sin of the world was already descending upon him. Jesus was identified with sinners even as a baby. From his circumcision to his purification, later he did the same thing in his baptism, and then finally on the cross, Jesus shows he's fully human, and he came to deliver us all from sin. The theologian Alexander White wrote this: "For he who knew no sin, and who never was to know sin, was already in his circumcision made sin for us. He was not so much as 8 days in this world till he began to be numbered with the transgressors. Mary's firstborn son was a lamb without blemish and without spot, but only a week old he began to bear the sins of many. And as he began in the temple that day, so he continued every day to lead a life of pain, shame, and bloodshed for us, for our children, till he finished on the cross the sin-atoning work his Father had given him to do. And ever after that day, first wounding for our transgressions, the holy thing bore in his body became the marks of our redemption." The sacrifice of the cross is obvious and so inescapable that we might miss what Christ sacrificed when he lived here on earth. Can you imagine standing with the Father in glory in one moment? The very next, he's hungry, cold, confused, and lying in the cow's trough of a manger. Can you imagine being the creator of the universe in one moment, then trapped in flesh and bone the next? Can you imagine knowing nothing except purity and goodness, and then suddenly being born into humanity, in depravity and sin? The cost that Jesus paid is an indication of how incredible of a value that you have to God. He gave up his privileged place in glory to live with us in humanity. If Jesus would have come as himself, wholly divine, we would have completely missed out on who he was. Because like Moses at the burning bush, we would not be able to look upon his glorified face. But instead, he took upon skin, flesh, and bone, that we could see him and we could know him. We could love him. God came as a baby in human flesh to take upon the sins of the world and deliver us from wrath. He walked this earth to be with you and to know your joy and your pain. He's ready to deliver you, to reach back his hand and take you to his side. I want to take a pause and share with you two things that I'm excited about. I hope they're deeply moving. The first is a video that it's actually a music video from a singer that talks about how his song is how he wants to be different. But he begins by sharing some of the struggle that he and his family have been going through recently. And some of you talks about one of the hurricanes. And so he'll share his testimony and then his video. I really hope you'd capture this idea of what he's sharing. And then afterwards, we have a testimony this morning. And so maybe carry these ideas in your heart that God came only to draw you closer and closer to him. Let's take a look. And there's somebody that's going to come up and share a little bit of their journey. And they've been on the journey with the Lord for a while, but it's been most recent that God is real. I'm just watching God make that change. And so she's going to come up and share a little bit. Elise, would you?
Hi, I'm Elise, as most of you know. Been going to this church for about 7 years now. Always believed in God, but I wasn't until recently that I have fully given my life to him. I'm not proud of many things that I've done in my life. Spent most of my early 20s drunk and partying all the time. I had a little boy who didn't deserve to see his mom the way I was. I always thought the only thing that could make things better was to drink my problems away. And when I was 26, I had another child. His name was Hayden. Was doing okay for a little while and being a good mother to my boys. But again, I started to feel depressed and got wrapped up in the world and started back into drinking again. I wasn't happy, but I'm getting nervous. I would always try to defend what I was doing and say, this is okay. You know, my kids are in bed. It's okay for me to be out drunk all the time. And I know in my heart that was wrong, but I still did it. And then a little while after that, I met a man. His name was Josh, and I fell in love with him. He helped me to see that I was living my life the way I didn't want to. And I gave it all up. I stopped drinking, stopped smoking pot, everything. It was really good for a little while, but then Josh was stuck in his own addiction. And a lot of struggles came with that. We then had, hold on a second. We then had our first child together, Brooklyn. And again, for a while, things went well. And I tried very hard because I loved him and I wanted our family to work. But the drugs were ruining everything. I then faced the most horrible thing that I've ever gone through, and my son Hayden passed away at almost 3 years old from an accident. This began a whole mess of things for me. Hold on. I'm sorry. It was very hard, but at this time I again tried to follow God and understand things. My faith began to grow. But I didn't understand why all these things were happening, why God would do this to me, why he would take my son and put my family through everything that was going on. I was doing good, and I actually went to beauty school and was trying to work on my future for me and my kids. And I then again found myself in a situation where I wanted to fit in, and I went back and started drinking again. So put myself in a place where I did the same thing. I defended what I was doing, saying, "Oh, I'm only doing this a couple times, a month," yeah, it was not good. And then I found out that I was going to have another child, and I didn't understand why this was happening. I wasn't ready. I was already struggling with the 2 kids that I had, but I lost my spot. I'm sorry. Anyway, so once again, the struggles that Josh and I were having, we tried to put our family back together because I was having another baby. It didn't last long. His drug use once again tore us apart, and me on my drinking. It got worse now, though. I was doing it more often than I was before. Still defending what I was doing, thinking this is okay, I'm not, but every time that I did drink, I drank so much that I couldn't remember anything that happened, and every time something bad happened. And then 3 months ago, Josh was killed in a car accident. I didn't know how to handle it. I didn't know how to function. I didn't understand, again, why was this happening to me. And all I wanted to do was get drunk. I wanted the pain to go away. And I did. And I did something that I'm not proud of. I got in my car and I drove. I woke up not knowing what happened. My car was a mess. I felt, how could I have done this? How could I have my children could have lost both of their parents in a matter of a week. I lost my spot again. I laid around for a few weeks feeling disgusted in myself, feeling lost. I didn't deserve anything I had. How could I do this to my kids, to my family? I felt lost. I was trying so hard to just get me back. Then something happened. I had been praying I ever had before. I felt something changing. I asked Carrie if he would meet with me and talk about the things that were going on. And then I just remember the night I sat there and I talked to God and asked him to just take over. I was ready to let him all the way in. I thought that I wanted to get me back, but I didn't want to get me back. I wanted to get a new me. I asked him to change me. I asked him to make me different. And that song right there really spoke to me. So it's been 2 months since then, and so much has changed in my life. I know why. Whoops, good job. Sorry, I'm horrible. I know why the Lord is working in me in ways I never thought. What I have done in my past, it doesn't matter. He loves me. I have so much to learn on my walk with God, but that makes this even more amazing. I know now more than ever where my son is, where Josh is, and I will continue to live my life for him so I can join them in heaven. Hard times are going to happen, but I keep faith in our Heavenly Father in my heart that I know I can handle and I can take on anything now. So, thank you.
She showed me that she had some notes, and there's several pages there. And I thought, oh, good, you got the sermon today. I'll just set it, I'll tee you up, and then you can preach. Wasn't that good? You know, a word of instruction. Mistakes have been made, and I just appreciate her honesty in that and her vulnerability. You know, so our job now as a church family is just to come alongside and show love and show support and encouragement that you keep on the journey that you're on, and in that maybe we consider our own journey. I'm just going to tie this up now. So I thought where this fit in is Elise just shared that she'd been learning a little bit. She'd been coming to church. She'd been around Christian people. It was kind of coming, but she needed to open her heart fully to God. And I just ask you this morning, is your heart and your hands fully open to God? Are you making a manger in your heart for the Christ to be born into? C.S. Lewis wrote these words: look for yourself, and you will find in the long run only hatred, loneliness, despair, rage, ruin, and decay. But look for Christ, and you will find him, and with him, everything else will be thrown in. Where is God for you right now? Is your heart and your hands completely open to Christ in your life? And you want to be closer to him and know him and let him work in you? Or maybe for you, God is at the temple. It's a place you go, and you enjoy that. But he's like a neighbor that you visit and check in on once in a while. You enjoy the visit. It brings that relational connection, maybe encouraging moments that help you move in and through your life. But then you leave and move on. Or maybe God is like a cloud that's hovering above. You hope that he's providing some sense of guidance and blessings from time to time. You know he's there. You know that you need his help, but there's still a distance. For others, I fear that there's maybe even a sense that God is a silent distance, not even a cloud in the sky. No idea or thought of how he could possibly impact your life. God's only desire for you is to fully and completely come into your life and help make that difference that every one of us so desperately needs. Let's pray. So, Father, may our hands and our hearts be open. That you would come into our lives and that you would have your way with us. That because of what Christ has done in taking on the sins of the world and giving us complete forgiveness, making us completely restored with you. May we walk with you. May we know you and seek you and long for your work in our lives. May we not keep you in a distance, but allow for you to come, Lord Jesus. In whose name we pray. Amen. May you draw closer to him each day this Christmas season, and we'll see you next Sunday.